This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where I'm speaking to horticulturist, journalist, host of the On the Ledge podcast, and author of a new book, Legends of the Leaf, Jane Perrone. Have you ever wondered why the leaves of the Swiss cheese plant have holes? How aloe vera came to be harnessed as a medicinal powerhouse? Or why, despite your best efforts, you can't keep your Venus flytrap alive? If you're familiar with the On the Ledge podcast, you'll know Jane takes deep dives into the background of houseplants, where they come from, how they behave, and how we can best grow them. My first question to Jane was, where did her love for houseplants first begin?
Well, it all started probably about age 5, 6, 7, when I first started buying cacti at jumble sales and places like that, and taking over the houseplants in my house and growing them and being given plants to rescue. I don't know why. I just, from a young child, just absolutely loved houseplants. But career-wise, horticulture or anything to do with houseplants was never on the radar at that stage. And I wanted to be a journalist. So at some point, a wonderful intersection occurred where I was able to combine my passion for plants with journalism. So that's how I've got where I am. And before I started my podcast about houseplants, I worked as gardening editor for The Guardian for 9 years. And during that time, I did a podcast for The Guardian with Alice Fowler called Sow, Grow, Repeat. We won an award for it. It was great. And then they cancelled it. So when that ended, that was when I missed podcasting terribly, because I love it. And I just thought, gosh, this is the time to start a houseplant podcast in February 2017, because I think houseplants are going to get really big, and I'm going to start a podcast now while the field is relatively empty.
There's so many interesting things, actually, you've said there. To start with, obviously you got the podcast bug. And actually, I was going to ask you later, but I might as well ask you now. You really have combined your passion with your profession, and I love that. And I'm sure there's so many people out there who would really, really want to do that. And I think sometimes it can be a bit scary. How did you manage it? Were there times when you felt like you were losing the faith, or did you just think, no, this is really what I want to do, I'm just going to go for it?
Well, by the time I went into garden writing as a form of journalism, I'd already done a master's degree in mass communication, which is basically journalism. I did a postgrad journalism qualification. I did 8, 9, 10 years at The Guardian doing news reporting. So after that, a bit of plants is absolutely a walk in the park. Like, the challenges of doing what I do are many and various, but it's not the same as dealing with really gnarly court cases or reporting live on 9/11 as it happened from the news desk. So I always think back to that and think, well, plants are lovely because generally there aren't a lot of sudden breaking news stories in the world of plants. And so I think I was well prepared because those journalism skills stood me in really good stead. But at the same time, the world of plants is calmer waters than I was used to. But I was able to put into place all those skills that I already had. So I was lucky in that regard. And when I left The Guardian to go freelance, it was stepping into the unknown. But I'd already started doing a bit of freelancing at that point. And I just loved being my own boss. And I particularly loved doing the podcast because there was nobody to say, oh, Jane, we want you to do this, or you come up with an idea and then somebody says, well, that's okay, but could you do it like this? With the podcast, it's me, and it's unadulterated me, for good or ill.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you said obviously you started it in 2017, and I think it would be probably an understatement to say that houseplants have had a moment. So are they still having that moment, or do you ever think, interested, this could wane, or people could kind of progress from the houseplants onto gardening outdoors? How do you think it's going? Are they still as trendy as they were?
There was a huge spike in 2020 and 2021, which I saw in my podcast figures for houseplants. It's died back a tiny bit. I think there were people who were at home furloughed during the pandemic who got seriously into houseplants. But once some of those people went back out into the world, that interest waned. But I think there are a lot of people for whom houseplants will continue to be a passion. And I think it has changed things. There's so many different factors that have brought houseplants back into popularity, from young people not being able to buy their own homes or have any outdoor space, to understanding of biophilia and the benefits of having greenery indoors. And also, these things are just cyclical. I'm old enough to sort of remember the last houseplant boom in the 70s when I was a child. So I think these things are cyclical. I mean, there's always going to be an element of a cycle going round. And I think at the moment we're on probably a slight wane from that massive peak. But certainly I meet so many more people who are into houseplants now than I did in 2017. And generally you don't get a funny look when you say that you like plants anymore.
No, you don't. And, you know, they are hugely popular, to the point where obviously you've got your podcast and you've now managed to publish a book about houseplants, which is amazing. And so 2 questions, really. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of model you used to publish it, but also why Legends of the Leaf?
Yeah, so Legends of the Leaf is the title of the book, and the subtitle, you always got to have a good subtitle, is Unearthing the Secrets to Help Your Plants Thrive. And this book was created with Unbound as my publisher. And if listeners haven't heard of Unbound, they are a crowdfunding publisher. So it's not like a Kickstarter where I get the money and then I have to write the book, edit the book, print the book, do everything myself. Unbound work on a regime where you raise the money and then they work like a conventional publisher in terms of editing and getting the book printed and distributed. The benefits of that being that I'm not very up on the best places to go and get your book printed or how to distribute books. So they are the experts in that, and that side of it is handled. But it does mean that you have to spend quite a long time crowdfunding. I was lucky that I already had a really well-established audience of listeners who were wonderful in pre-ordering the book and paying up front for it and then patiently waiting for it to come out. And Legends of the Leaf, well, I can't quite remember the process of coming up with the name, but it obviously slightly plays on my podcast's name, which is On the Ledge. So I guess that's part of it. I wanted it to sound slightly sort of epic. I wanted a bit of an epic name. And I wanted also it to be something where you knew that you weren't just getting a straightforward how-to guide to growing houseplants, which this book does contain some of that, but that's not what it's all about.
Interesting. Yes, because I have to say there are a lot of houseplant books out there and sometimes it's difficult to navigate. But what I like about your book and your podcast is that you're really scientific. You really delve into the actual research that's been done around plants. And I wondered if through that research you'd found anything. I'm sure you've found loads of things, but have you found anything that's really particularly surprising in terms of discovering about how plants grow, what's best for them? Or did you kind of bust any really persistent myths?
There's loads to say on this, but one thing I would say is I was continuously amazed by just how incredible plants are at adapting to their environments. So one element of the book with these 25 iconic species that I've profiled is looking at how they grow in the wild. And oftentimes that's kind of missed out of the care description when you get a plant. And if you know how it grows in the wild, it massively helps you to understand how to make it thrive in your house. So one of the classics for this is the string of pearls, Senecio rolianus, the plant formerly known as Curio rolianus. And this is a very popular, trendy houseplant, but almost everybody kills them because they're quite difficult to maintain. But when you start to find out how they grow in the wild, it really helps you to understand how to grow it at home. And when you start looking at those little globular leaves, you realise that actually the plant is adapted to deal with places where it cannot lose water. So the surface area to volume ratio is such that the plant's able to store lots of water in its leaves and not lose a lot through those leaves. Those leaves also have this incredible little green stripe across them, a darker green sort of translucent stripe, which if you look really closely, you can see. And this is a modification that quite a few succulents have. It's a leaf window, and we don't quite fully understand how these work yet. But basically, it's the way the plant is able to channel light for photosynthesis and control temperatures within the leaf. And that is what that window does. You can also see it in things like Horworthias, and that's telling you that this plant lives in very high light conditions. So when you're growing it at home, you need to not put this plant in a really dark corner because it just doesn't like it. And the other thing about it is that it grows as a mat. It doesn't hang down in massive curtains as we often see it planted. And the root system is actually really thin and fibrous and shallow. And so it's very important that you take utmost care with your watering, particularly in winter, because most people just rot it away through overwatering and the wrong substrate. So that's an example of just that little bit of understanding that you can have of how a plant grows in the wild just massively affects how you look after it in your home. And that's what I'm hoping people will get from the book. Plus also there's lots of interesting stories and anecdotes and ways that plants have been used in cultural and social and even religious terms that are included in here. But yeah, string of pearls. If I can get a few people to grow their string of pearls successfully, I'll be happy.
Well, I wish I'd had your book when I had my string of pearls, which I did kill, predictably. But yeah, you're right. The book is full of like really interesting background information and also really iconic species. How did you narrow that down to the plants that you did actually profile in the book in the end?
Well, I went for 25 and I'm sure people will argue with me about the ones I've chosen. But hey, one of the joys of crowdfunding your book is it really is your baby. So I chose the ones that I thought were iconic, and there were obvious ones to go in there, like the Swiss cheese plant, Monstera deliciosa. Obviously, that is probably the most iconic plant in the world. I also tried to choose ones that had quite a lot of cultural freight over history, things like the Kentia palm, Howea fosteriana, which was much beloved of the Victorians and very significant in bringing the idea of the palm court to interior design sensibilities. And then there were a few that I just thought deserved to be in there because maybe I'm a bit biased, but I absolutely love them. So I wanted to make sure there was some cacti and succulents in there. So we've got the jade tree, very, very iconic plant that is popular all around the world. And then I also included things like the bunny ears cactus, Opuntia microdaisies, which is a really gorgeous little cactus. And then also the Venus flytrap, which, you know, millions are sold every year in DIY stores and very few last more than a few weeks. So I tried to pick the ones that had interesting stories and also were things that most people would recognise even if they weren't sure of the name.
Yes. When you read it, you think, yeah, these are the real classics. It's a great selection. And I wondered, kind of tying into that, there are the classic plants, but there's also, especially because of things like Instagram, there's this tendency at the moment to always be seeking the novel. People are getting larger and larger collections of houseplants. So I just wondered actually what your take was on the next big thing. Are there any plants that people are getting really excited about at the moment?
Well, I think aroids were the huge sort of 2021 phenomenon, and Hoyas probably just came in after that as a sort of another wave of interest. I'm hoping, I mean, I'm pushing this. I don't know if I'm doing this with any chance of success, but I'm thinking that maybe flowering houseplants are going to come back into fashion. It's been all about the leaves for the last few years, and I really love flowering houseplants, particularly members of the Gesneriad family like Apicias and Streptocarpus and Columneas and Escananthus. I'm hoping people are going to start growing some more of those, and there are signs that they are becoming more popular. And some of the old classics from the 70s are coming back. So I'm suddenly seeing Pilea, like Pilea Moon Valley, coming back, which was really hard to get for a long time, which is this foliage plant with these amazing wrinkled leaves that's really stunning. So there's a few things coming along, and I think probably the aroid trend is going to continue onwards, but definitely more flowering plants coming onto the agenda. And just classics like cacti and succulents are always going to be popular. They're just an absolute must-have for me anyway. Probably I'm biased, but I do love cacti and succulents, and I think they are always going to be popular.
Yeah, interesting. I wonder if, obviously, the aroids are, I suppose, easier to grow in a typical home environment. I say that, now I'm thinking about it, and I'm thinking about the humidity and everything. I know it's not straightforward, it's not that easy. But I suppose people are drawn towards things that are suited to their conditions in their house. But Again, now I've said that, I'm not sure they are, because like I said, I've killed plants, I've killed streptocarpus, I've killed all sorts of plants. So it might be quite nice actually if people could find plants that were really suited to growing indoors. Cacti and succulents aren't always the greatest. So yeah, it's really fascinating to think about. And actually, that kind of brings me on to thinking about, is it sustainable? I know everybody was kind of really into houseplants. And I know because I had a shop at the time and I sold a lot of houseplants with my partner. He had the shop and we kind of used to buy plants and they were flying off the shelves because everybody got so into them. And then I kind of started to question, actually, it is a bit of a throwaway culture if you pick plants that don't necessarily like your house and therefore they're going to keel over and die. Or you're importing these plants in big quantities from the continent. You're not sure whether they're growing pesticides. At the time, we weren't sure about the kind of peat content of the soil they were grown in. So I think people started to ask questions about the sustainability of houseplants. And I think maybe moves have been made in the direction to make it more environmentally friendly. Are you seeing that as well as a trend?
I mean, it's something I've been banging on about on the podcast for quite a while. Probably, I think I did my first sustainability episode. I'd have to check back, but probably 2018, 2019, because for me at that time, the elephant in the room was peat in houseplants. The peat-free campaign had really got underway here in the UK, but nobody was talking about peat in houseplants and nobody was talking about plastic in relation to houseplants either. And it's something that's really important to me. And I always try to point people in the direction of sustainable practice when it comes to houseplants. So that comes on a number of fronts. And one of them is asking questions about where are you buying them from and what are they grown in? Is it peat? Is it coir? Is it something else? And I always try to recommend people check that and also buy from specialist growers who tend to plant their houseplants into substrates that actually suit them. So oftentimes when you buy a cactus or a succulent from a big box DIY store or a supermarket, it's planted in something that long term the plant is not going to be happy in, which is disappointing because then you lose your plant because it's turned to a ball of mush and you don't know what you've done wrong. And the reality is, well, you didn't know that you needed to repot that into a really free draining cactus and succulent mix. So that's one aspect. I also try to urge people to do their research. Like you were saying, lots of people are not thinking about their homes before they go out and buy plants, and they don't really understand the plant's needs. That's partly because oftentimes they're really poorly labelled and don't have the correct information on them in the first place. So I try to encourage people to sort of be mindful when buying houseplants of where that houseplant's going to go and also their mindset. Like, are you just buying that plant to complete your collection, or do you actually need that? It sounds ridiculous, but do you need that plant? Could you instead try growing that plant from seed, or could you get a cutting from somebody and raise it that way? So I'm always trying to urge people to think about those sustainability issues. And it's tough, it's complex and there's no easy answers. And I'm not going to say I've never bought a plant in Tesco, because I'm sure I have. But if you can try to be mindful of those questions when you're buying houseplants, I think it's enormously helpful. And it does hopefully make your houseplants more sustainable. On the peat matter, I have probably been using only peat-free substrates for my houseplants for the last at least 5 years, I would say. So it's perfectly possible to grow everything, including carnivorous plants, in peat-free. But until very recently, there were very few products that were marketed as houseplant peat-free compost specifically. So there's a way to go with educating people about sustainability in houseplants.
I think you have done excellent work on that front, and we can only move forward from there. And I said I wouldn't put you on the spot, but actually I am going to, because I was thinking about what you were saying about right plant, right place indoors. I mean, there's loads of rooms people are going to want to put houseplants in, but maybe 3 crop up quite often, and I think they can be tricky. So I'm going to ask you 3 different rooms, 3 different plants that you would choose that have a really good chance of success in general in these rooms. And my first one is the kitchen, the second one's the bathroom, and the third one is the conservatory. Do you have any tips for those spaces?
So when you're looking at any room, you need to look at the size and location of your windows. So if you've got a kitchen that has a lovely big south-facing window or a glass roof or a Velux window, you've got a combination of two things. You've got plenty of sun and you've got probably more humidity than you've got in other areas of the house because you've got pans on the hob, you've got the kettle boiling. So you're looking for plants that are adapted to lots of light and a bit of humidity as well. So that will direct you towards certain plants, probably tropical plants. People are very scared of light when it comes to houseplants, but actually most houseplants, in fact, will be better off with more light than you're giving them. Most people aren't giving their houseplants enough light, but it's a question of gradually adapting them. So you move them gradually into the light rather than shoving them straight into the sun. So if you've got a sunny-ish kitchen, probably the world's your oyster. You can grow pretty much anything. If your kitchen is north-facing and you've got a tiny window, you are much more limited. But you might be looking at things like some ferns, which would enjoy that extra humidity, would probably be a good choice. And it's also worth remembering, kind of moving on to the bathroom, that if you have a bathroom with no natural light, people often ask me this question. I've got no natural light in my bathroom. Can I have plants in there? And the answer is kind of always yes and no. Over a long period of time, by which I mean a few months, a plant with no natural light, maybe some natural light coming in through a doorway, is going to decline. But what you could do is you could have a range of different plants that you move in and out of that room, maybe the same plant. So you have the plant in the bathroom for a few weeks and then you switch it out with another plant to give it time to recover in between. Bathrooms can be amazing, but you've got to have a sort of a huge window, and obviously naturally bathrooms have windows that are frosted oftentimes, so light levels tend to be quite low. So often I do recommend that, sort of switching plants in and out to make sure that they get the chance to recover in between times. But yeah, bathrooms can be great for humidity. You can put plants in there if you do have good light that love that humid environment. So you can have air plants if you don't want to have a lot of soil or things, big pots of soil in your bathroom. You could just have a wire frame covered in air plants, which would look amazing, and you can just spray it down with water every week or so, and that looks incredible. What was the last room? I've forgotten.
The Room of Doom, the conservatory.
Oh, the Room of Doom, the conservatory. Well, yes. Now, this is interesting. I have a glass roofed. The walls aren't glass, but the ceiling is glass, and it's got patio doors at the end. And it is brilliant for plants, but it's north facing. People really struggle when they have a south facing conservatory because it just absolutely bakes in summer. My north facing sunroom gets very hot, but it doesn't get as hot as it would do were it facing the opposite direction. That can be a real struggle. But conservatories can be great like that for cacti and succulents, particularly if they get cold in winter. So if maybe the temperature in that conservatory is down to about 10 degrees centigrade, oftentimes that's the best place to have cacti and succulents over the winter. And this is often the downfall of those plants, that most of them, I'm generalising here, but most of them like a cool, dry winter dormancy break time. And in our homes, when they're centrally heated, they don't often get that. But if they're in a conservatory where they can be baked in the summer, you can water them generously, and then as you get through to autumn, ease off on that water and let them dry out. That conservatory getting down to about 10, even down to about 5 centigrade will be fine for a lot of succulents. You've got the ideal environment to get those thriving, but you do need to just be careful with the sun. It is very bright and plants will need to adapt gradually, and other things like tropical plants will probably get baked. So that's a tough one. If you've got a north-facing conservatory like mine, there's more options. But what I would say is a lot of my plants do get moved between summer and winter, because in the winter I move them to places where they would fry in the summer. So you've got to be prepared to do some moving stuff about in those environments, but they can be useful. It's just choosing the right plants and getting them hardened off to those kind of conditions.
Yes, I think you're right. Actually, I think there might be a tendency for people to think, I'm going to buy this plant, I'm going to plonk it down there, and that's where it's going to live for the rest of its life. But like, for example, mine indoors, they go outside in the summer and they go into a shady outdoor polytunnel, basically. And I have to be really careful with slugs. So it's not straightforward, but there is a lot to be said for actually nursing them and doing what is good for them at that particular time. So I've reached the end of my questions. So I am delighted to leave it there if you are. But before I go, is there anything that you wanted to just say in terms of people finding you? I think obviously you've mentioned the podcast On the Ledge and you've mentioned the book, but if they did want to get the book, where would they get it from?
Well, if you go to my website, janeperrone.com, all the details are there and you can find places to pre-order the book. It should be, I hope, in all good bookshops, online and off in the UK. And yeah, there's all the information there. You can listen to the podcast there, and there's tons of other stuff to access. And I'm just very grateful to my 900 people who paid up in advance to get a copy, who'll be getting their copy in the run up to publication on April the 27th.
A very big thank you to Jane for sharing her enthusiasm and expertise, and for lifting the lid a bit on making your passion your profession. And thanks to you for listening. Dr. Ian Bedford is here now with the lowdown on one particular group of bugs.
One of the most widespread and recognisable groups of insects around the world are the Lepidopterans, the butterflies and moths, of which there are around 180,000 different species that have been recorded so far. Lepidopterans are assumed to have evolved from caddisfly around 200 million years ago, when, through a natural mutation, the aquatic larvae of a caddisfly were able to survive and develop on terrestrial plants. And so, these pioneering aquatic invertebrates would have started off a brand new evolutionary branch, along which they would have had to adapt to the environmental changes of existing within a terrestrial ecosystem. And it's these terrestrial caddisflies that are what we consider to have been the first moths, nocturnal flying insects which over the millions of years that followed evolved different sets of biological characteristics that helped them to survive within their different habitats, which consequently created distinct biotypes and then different species. But one of the more radical features that moths evolved along their evolutionary journey was an appendage that we call a proboscis, a long-coiled tubular mouthpart that enabled them to suck up sugar-rich plant sap and generate energy to prolong their lives and sustain flight. However, plants were continuing to evolve too, and when the flower-bearing angiosperms appeared, they were able to use the sap-sucking insects for their own benefit, enticing them to visit flowers with sugar-rich nectar where they'd be dusted with pollen that they'd spread to fertilise other flowers. And as plants competed for the pollination services of other nectar-feeding insects such as the daytime flying bees, they evolved ever more ways to attract the insects with colours, shapes and fragrances. And so it's not too surprising that, around 98 million years ago, a daytime flying moth evolved from the nocturnal species that were feeding on plant sugars. A moth that went on to diversify into around 20,000 different daytime flying species worldwide. The species that collectively we call the butterflies, all of which display the same set of conserved biological characteristics that enable us to tell the difference between butterflies and moths today. So, it's a butterfly if it has all of these characters. It flies during the day, it has narrow antennae that are club-shaped at the end, and it closes its wings together in an upright position when it's at rest. If not, it'll be a moth.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.